Merry Christmas and welcome to the British Sitcom History Podcast. Merry Christmas to you, Alan.
Ho, ho, and thrice ho.
And Merry Christmas to me, Gareth. And Merry Christmas to all of our lovely listeners. It's our traditional Christmas episode this week. And in the past, what have we looked at in the past? We've looked at Christmas episodes of Rising Damp last year.
Yeah, Time Gentlemen, Please, we definitely did.
Oh, that's right, yes. Well, this year we're going back to a classic sitcom, and a sitcom that we have covered in detail before, which is Till Death Us Do Part.
Yes.
And it's the first episode of the second series it went out on Boxing Day 1966. So, I mean, that is amazing. It's nearly 60 years ago.
It is amazing, really, isn't it? I say that. Well, this is right after the first series. Well, it's right before the second series, but the first series of Till Death Us Do Part came out in 66. The beginning of the second series, but straight away a Christmas special, I think, probably suggests there was some popularity to the show.
Well, it's Boxing Day, not Christmas Day, so that probably tells you a little bit about the scheduling. But you're right. You're right. But this was actually, because I checked the dates, this was actually the start of the second series. So the next
it wasn't
episode
a standalone
was
thing
on the 2nd of January and so on and so forth. So it was the start of a new series rather than just a Christmas special.
And you got to bear in mind as well, back in the day, these things did go out live as well. So doing a special wasn't like, oh, we'll knock it out while we're doing something else and just put it on the shelf. Like, everyone has to get in. You have to do all the rehearsals and the costumes and blah, blah, blah. So it's like, you just lay it in with a series. But yeah, they're opening with a Christmas special. And Till Death Us Do Part, we have done a whole big 2-parter episode on this. If you want to go back in more detail, do go and listen to that. But today we're just looking at this particular episode. We're going to have a bit of fun with the Christmassy stuff. Yeah. And I think that's great. This is a great one to do because Till Death Us Do Part is a pretty traditional family sitcom. It is this family dynamic between the older and younger generation and the conflict that comes with Christmas that we're all familiar with.
Yeah, the hot house of Christmas dinner. And again, we've covered in quite a lot of detail Till Death Us Do Part. So, if you haven't already listened to that, go back and listen. But the thing is, obviously it is not without controversy as a sitcom. But rather than get into the bones of that again, I think what this episode really highlights is that generational clash and the difference in attitude between Alf and the Randy Skarsgård, his son-in-law, Mike.
Yeah, and this for me is proper classic Till Death Us Do Part. This is the good Till Death Us Do Part.
This is what worked about it. That generational clash. The impotent fury of Alf Garnett, who's got his own home, his own castle, his own family, and then there's this interloper who's coming in with his brash ideas and his long hair, and it's a classic trope, isn't it? It was one of the first to do it.
And Till Death Us Do Part did kind of go all over the place. There were episodes where it was fairly silly and Alf has got to fix the pipes and then there's water spouting all over the place, proper physical comedy and stuff. They would kind of do all sorts of things. This is what I love about it, classic. We get our characters, they're sat in one room. It's basically a one-act play.
Yeah.
They're talking to each other and falling out.
When I started making my notes here, the first thing I've written down is opening scene. And what I didn't know when I wrote that down was this was the only scene. There's one cutaway where Alf goes and answers the door, but apart from that, they're just sat around the Christmas dinner table for the whole half hour.
I love it. I love this sort of stuff. I love this kind of writing, kind of almost just like a play. And you get a lot more of that back in the 60s.
It's very stagey, very play-like.
The way it worked. Yeah, these days you don't get that so much. But let's just break it down. Just the overview, the Garnett family. We have Alf Garnett, the paterfamilias, sort of a working-class Tory who works on the docks. His wife, who has been a stay-at-home wife her whole life.
Else. Now, to me, Else is the hero of this sitcom. She's the classic long-suffering wife character. But I think Dandy Nichols' performance is fantastic. It's understated. It's very quiet. But her interventions are always cutting. Her timing's brilliant. I think she's great.
And it's very real. It's very real. I think when we talked about this before, it's like, oh God, that reminds me of my granny or her kind of contemporaries or whatever it was. It was that kind of, that life, that the woman's life of being sort of saddled to some dickhead man because they got you pregnant.
Yeah, exactly. And now you're stuck there.
But then we have Una Stubbs as the daughter Rita. She is she was mid-20s, I think, is the character supposed to be at this point.
Yeah.
And she's taken up with her man, and they're married and living in the family home.
They're still living in the family home because he can't provide for her because he's not got a proper job.
Because he's a long layabout.
Exactly.
But he's a 60s socialist, and he's a very kind of, he's a very sexy, free-thinking, sexy 60s swinging guy.
I mean, have a look at him. I'm not disagreeing with you, but I mean, have a look at him. He's not sexy, is he?
He's a sexy man. It's all about your taste.
He's coded sexy. Like, we are supposed to believe he's sexy, but take a step back, look again, not sexy.
So yeah, that's Tony Booth. He's the Scouse git. Warren Mitchell is Alf Garnett, who despises him, but seems to love the fight, and that is definitely something that within Till Death Us Do Part that I cannot particularly associate with, is that love of the fight. Like, if I was in this situation, I'd be like, "Look, we don't get on. I'm just gonna move away. I'm gonna get out of here." But they love it. They love to shout at each other, and they're not
sparring.
And there's no like long-term effect of that. I mean, there is, because they're just falling out all the time. But you know what I mean? They don't fall out and then like, oh God, I'm not talking to him ever again. It's like, look, oh yeah, we fell out. Now let's shake hands, have a drink, and
they get drunk together and they're all right. It's never irretrievable, is it? There's always there's always a way back.
So we start our episode. They're well into Christmas dinner, and obviously the radio's on in the background because the Queen's just done a speech, and the national anthem is playing. The national
anthem is playing. This is a nice bit of camera work, isn't it? Because we pan across the table, and we see Tony Booth, Mike, who's eating his chicken off his drumstick, and then he leans over and he feeds it to Rita. It's all very affectionate and loving. Then we cut across to Else, and she's eating her dinner. And then we cut across to the next seat, and instead of seeing Alf, well, we see Alf, but we see his midriff, because Alf is standing to attention for the national anthem.
And so that we get our first immediately. That stimulates our first argument. And what should you not talk about around the Christmas dinner table when you're with your family this year? Politics,
religion, the monarchy.
Yeah, we're going to get everything.
Before we get into the conversation, which will inevitably follow, can I just point out that Warren Mitchell is standing at perfect attention, and when the national anthem finishes, he stands at ease, and he does it right. And I am saying that is evidence that Warren Mitchell was in the forces. He was in the RAF, wasn't he? Not the army.
I don't know for sure, but he's of the age he would have done national service at least. You know, he would.
And you can tell, I was in the army for like 2.5 years in the early 1990s, and I can still do that. And if I stand to attention, my hand does exactly what Warren Mitchell's hand does when he stands at ease. Exactly, like that is programmed deep. It's not something I do very often. Like, I don't do it when the national anthem plays, but I know that if I was called upon, it would look good.
So now, of course, Alf respects the royal family because he's the working class conservative. He believes the upper classes are bred to lead. So he knows his place. Let's put it like that. They also make reference to, basically, he's talking about how the Queen, oh, look, she's such a great leader. She's given up her Christmas dinner so that she can talk to us and give us a speech. Now, for me, I was like, oh, well, that's obviously a joke because, you know, it's pre-recorded in, you know, August or whatever.
It might not have been then.
Why not have been then? I was thinking that when I was going through that. I was thinking maybe it wasn't actually because, you know, even this episode went out live. They didn't have the same sort of technology.
I think what they used to do, I haven't researched this, but I think what they used to do is they would take all the recording equipment to Buckingham Palace, have her in situ speaking it live, I think. I'm not sure when that would have changed. I know that these days it's recorded in, you know, September or something.
What is it? I don't know if I've ever even listened to one recently.
Well,
you know what? I know it's an Annus Horribilis and all that sort of thing.
It's not something I watch regularly. But yeah, the King's speech is the state opening of Parliament. That's a whole different thing, and that's just written by the government. It's basically just says, "Oh, my government's going to do this. My government's going to do that." That's not what this is. This is the King's personal message to his subjects.
Yeah.
And I don't know. Let's go back to the Queen. I don't know how much she wrote it, or she had speech writers to write it for her. I don't know exactly who inputs what, but it is her and her people, not the government. It's a personal message. I guess I don't know whether it would have to be cleared through the government. I don't know how that would work politically.
Let me throw a little sort of tangent at you here, because it just so happens that when I did my master's degree in film studies, which is my qualifications here.
Bit of a flex there.
I did, although technically it was film studies, I did kind of all sorts of different media. And I did a whole module about early radio.
And people say it's a bullshit degree.
I know, exactly. Yeah? But I specifically wrote a paper on how radio affected the perception of the royal family in the public mind. But it put the king, this kind of semi-deistic being, into your home. It humanized them. You heard their voice, and it made them real. And then sort of 2 years later, one of them abdicated, and there was a whole kind of scandal. And
are you saying that was the thin end of the wedge? It was the end of monarchy,
it was the humanization.
Just
of
a few
monarchy.
years later, we have It's a Royal Knockout.
Well, yeah, basically, 50 years later, I am saying that, pretty much. And obviously, there's a bigger cultural change there. But that is, like I say, the royal family, Queen Victoria, was this kind of almost, godly figure above us who, was ordained by God to rule the country. Whereas Prince Charles, is getting the piss ripped out of him on Spitting Image every week. It's like...
So you're saying that change started with the radio? The wireless.
That was my theory that I wrote a paper on. but yeah.
Well, you got the degree, didn't you?
Yeah, exactly. I passed. Basically, it was the humanization of the royal family, and so
it's an interesting theory.
It's interesting. I don't know how deep you want to go into that, but this is part of that. Alf Garnett is saying the Queen, our Queen, is taking time out of her day to talk to us, the subjects, and I don't care if I'm stood in my home at my own. I'm going to bloody respect it, and I'm going to stand into attention.
Listen, you traitorous scarce git. I got a bit of respect for Her Majesty, I have. Just have her Christmas dinner late because of doing that speech. She has to go up to the BBC.
Well, they keep it warm for her, though.
Look, she has to go up to the BBC.
Oh, they put it in the oven for her.
Look, she has to go up to the studio.
Look, he'd see to that.
Look, she has to go up
He'd make sure it was kept up for her.
Shut up, you silly moo!
Well, Else, interestingly, Else is... she keeps saying, when he says he's talking about... she keeps saying, and him. Is she talking about Prince Philip? Is she talking about Duke of Edinburgh?
Yeah. So
she seems oddly obsessed about and him.
Well, she keeps making a point that even though the Queen is very busy, Prince Philip helps out. And I think she's just trying to push Alf.
Is that what it is? She's not particularly burning a candle for the Duke of Edinburgh. It's just she's just poking at Alf.
She's like, well, if she had to go out, he'd make sure that the dinner was kept warm.
Well, obviously, Mike is a Republican.
Yeah, well, I'm a Republican, aren't I? You are an ignorant, misbegotten, lying layabout, socialist, scarce git. That's what you are.
Wow, what wonderful writing. I like that a lot.
Just speaking of the writing as well, this certainly early, Till Death Us Do Part, was filmed, well, it was done live, but it was written really quite close to when it was. So there's kind of very topical references.
Yeah.
And even in later ones, they kind of had gaps in the script ready to drop little things in, a bit like Drop the Dead Donkey always did.
When we discussed this at length, when we talked about it before, I seem to remember saying that often those last-minute things were not quite dropped in time because Johnny Spate was a bit late with it.
Yeah, that was a sort of increasingly a problem with the recording schedule.
I am for those listening in audio. I'm making the drinks a little bit sign with my hand.
He could get distracted easily. Put it that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, but my point is that it's making topical references and it's kind of drawing on the politics of the day and really.
Well, I've got lots to say about the politics that come up.
Yeah,
in
we're
this
coming
episode.
up to that. Yeah.
So right now, obviously Mike is criticising Her Majesty, and Alf says, "Well, where's your Wilson? Where's your darling Harold today?" And Mike starts to defend Harold Wilson because he's a Labour man.
Now, I really want to put this into place. If you could just tell us what. The Labour government, Harold Wilson's Labour government, which was a very progressive government,
Yeah.
Swept all sorts of social changes that we're still benefiting from today.
Yeah.
What are the years?
So the years are 1964 to 1970, and then Heath came in for 4 years, and then Labour were back in again in 74 to, Wilson resigned in 76. So this is Christmas 66. They've only been in power for 2 years. So they've started to have an impact, but not necessarily made all of those changes yet.
I just wanted to look at the kind of the history of the show in context here. Does Alf Garnett exist with a Labour government? Does he work with a Tory government? Because he needs to rail against, right? Otherwise, he's just going, because the Alf Garnett story goes on, the Alf Garnett saga, dare I say, goes on for years and years, including throughout the Thatcher years.
Yeah, the 80s, yeah.
And basically what they end up doing is having railing against the Thatcher government in one way or another. He's like, I agree with them obviously about this, but this. And I think you can work that because he's the sort of man who's going to argue about whatever. But does he work in the mid-60s? Does he work in this mid to late 60s period of social movement because he is the anchor who is trying to stop it?
It's interesting. You get a lot of... there's been a lot of satirists of the last few years that had a bit of a panic when Labour won the last election because that's their entire shtick gone. Well, I think like you said, you gave good examples there. You can adapt. You can... The powers that be, the establishment remains the establishment, and you can always rail against. But I think you've got a good point. I think it helps. I think it enhances this family dynamic that Labour are in charge, because that dynamic is exactly that. Alf's the put upon, impotent paterfamilias, and this invading next generation is literally inside the walls, and they've even got the government. I think it helps that dynamic.
Do you know what? Maybe this says a lot about my lifestyle choices, but I think I have probably seen less of Harold Wilson than I have of Mike Yarwood doing Harold Wilson. Almost certainly.
The pound in your pocket. That was I actually, do you know what? That's relevant. So that little expression, the pound in your pocket, that was something that Wilson said, and that's like when I think of Mike Yarwood doing Harold Wilson, that's the sentence that comes into my head, and that's devaluation. So he was saying the pound in your pocket is not worth any less. And if you go to America and convert it to currency, it is, but the pound in your pocket is worth the same. You can still buy the same loaf of bread, etc. When I was doing a little bit of reading on this, and I was reading balance of payments, deficit, and devaluation, those terms all feel so old-fashioned. They sort of hit my ears like Freddie and the Dreamers, but they were just massive. Like, everybody would have been talking about those in the same way that we now talk about, Brexit and the pandemic. They were just like, they were the subjects of political discussion.
Can I just pull up a couple other sort of topical references that get made here, politics-wise? Mike refers to a sort of like, did you see him on TV the other night? Like, literally like a TV interview with that geek David Frost, he says.
Yeah.
So that's how up-to-date this was.
I've got notes on that too. So
okay.
It was the Frost Report. The Frost Report was David Frost doing satire. It was very much in the early days of satire. Peter Cook had done an impression of Harold Macmillan on stage. And Harold Macmillan had seen it, and it had a really big effect on him, and that had been part of that demystifying of politics. Just a couple of years later, the Frost Report appears, and they're at the time fairly savagely satirising politicians. One of the things they did on that show is that they would show footage of politicians making a speech or being interviewed or speaking, and they overdubbed their words with a silly accent. So it was the same words. They weren't putting words in their mouth. It was exactly the same words, but just with a Yorkshire accent. Or in Wilson's case, they had this sort of high-pitched accent. And that's what they're talking about on this episode.
That's how they dealt with Jerry Adams back in the 90s. But that was,
yeah, it is.
That was a legitimate news thing. And also we get a few of the politicians mentioned, specifically towards transport secretaries.
Oh, nice.
And getting mocked because Transport Secretary Marples, I'm not sure who that is.
Marples?
Yeah.
What do you want to know about Marples, mate? I've done the research.
The former Transport Secretary. But they basically joke about him. How can he be Transport Secretary because he's got a bike?
Yeah, so speaking as a cyclist, I kind of resented this. But yeah, so Ernest Marples had been the Transport Secretary for the Tories before they'd lost that election in 1964. And, I've got a list of his achievements here, but none of them matter because he used to cycle around and therefore was a complete loser.
How things change, eh? Because that's the way of showing how you're really in touch with your green transport things.
In the interests of completion and the fact that I've spent the time researching this, here's the things that Ernest Marple introduced: the MOT test, parking meters, traffic wardens, double yellow lines, and provisional licences. He also appointed Dr. Richard Beeching to write a report on the loss-making railways, which feeds into a sitcom link. Oh, Dr. Beeching!
Yeah.
Actually, it turned out it was a bit of a wrong one, but that didn't emerge until later. He had a fondness for professional ladies, and he did a midnight flick to Monaco at some point in the 70s to avoid a big tax bill.
Classic. Back to basics.
Back to basics.
Barbara Castle gets dropped in as well.
Barbara Castle was the Labour Minister of Transport, so she'd taken over that job after the election.
She can't even drive!
She can't even drive. Now, I actually couldn't qualify if that was true or not, but I'll believe him. But actually, I've got a lot of time for Barbara Castle. She was a real groundbreaker in terms of, women in politics.
Yeah.
She was an MP from 1945 until 79. In that time, in all the Labour governments, she was in the cabinet. She was Minister of Transport. She went on to be Employment Secretary. She introduced the Equal Pay Act in the early 1970s as Employment Secretary, which is, of course, equalised pay between men and women. It's always been equal since. And then she was sort of Health Secretary in the at the end of the Wilson term. She introduced child benefit. That was her doing as well.
This is an apolitical podcast, but there seems like a difference between that Conservative member and the Labour member and their achievements and legacy.
I've got my political leanings, but that was a list of facts, Alan. I don't know how you can put a political spin on simply a list of facts. Well, look, I'll tell you what. Let's bring this back to Till Death Us Do Part. So lovely little bit of politics there, but that is talked about in the context of them having this political back and forth, this political joust. Bring it back to the Queen. He was talking about how Wilson ain't her kind of Prime Minister. So, obviously she would prefer to have a Tory Prime Minister, Her Majesty.
Which I think is true, to be honest.
Apparently, and so, I mean, if I've learned anything from The Crown, it's that Olivia Colman and Harold Wilson got on really well.
Is that right?
Yeah. No. I have watched The Crown, but apparently it's true. Apparently they had a lot of personal warmth towards each other, even though they weren't what you might call politically aligned. And, or as Alf Garnett said, Her Majesty don't want him round the palace all day, knocking his pipe out on the furniture. Knocking his pipe out. That's a phrase which just doesn't exist anymore.
Time to move into racism. But first of all, they've got a keg of beer in for Christmas.
Oh yeah, I noticed this. So the glass is empty. So he goes over to get himself another drink, and he's got a little wooden barrel on the sideboard.
Yeah, but you get that in for Christmas, innit? Because you're not just Christmas Day. You've got a whole week of you're probably not at work. You got how many pints does that thing hold?
I had the same question. How many pints is one of those little wooden casks? Because with the two of them going at it, I'm not sure it'd last beyond Boxing Day, that.
Let's say they got through 4 pints within the 25 minutes of the show. So
yeah.
So we do get into a bit of racism here.
We come to the racism section, but and there's a category C racial epithet.
Yeah.
A pretty strong one, which you wouldn't use now, and I'm certainly not going to say out loud.
There's a few of them.
Yeah, that's true.
And it really it starts with Alf celebrating the completely unabashed racism of Winston Churchill. Mm-hmm. Like if Winnie was here, he wouldn't have let him.
He'd have told him where to go.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't use those words.
I'm prepared to say this out loud. What he said was Churchill would have told them, "Get back to the jungle, get your blooming drums out."
Yes. And he would have. That's the interesting thing.
It's funny because it's
about
true.
The British hero Winston Churchill. So yeah, we dealt with the racism element particularly when we talked about things. I don't want to go over and over again. This is satire, and this character is presented as a figure of fun, but was not always taken in the way that it was intended. Yeah, it's a difficult line to kind of straddle. Of being real and presenting this character as they were. These are people you met in the pub. This was your uncle. This was your dad, whatever it was. But also giving them enough rope to kind of show that they're being quite ridiculous.
Well, this might be a good time to talk about the other thing that we watched this week.
Yeah.
So the reason I think this is excusable is that, you know, the character is being mocked and he's being challenged in the around his dinner table. Whereas we watched what was ostensibly Alf Garnett doing stand-up. What was it called? That it was like a special.
It was called, and the reason I sort of looked at this, it was called The Thoughts of Chairman Alf at Christmas.
That's right.
And it just sort of flagged up because we were doing a Christmas special. Oh, let me watch that. And it's not really that Christmas related particularly, but I found it fascinating.
It is fascinating. It's Warren Mitchell in character in front of a studio audience, like doing a one-man show, essentially.
Yeah, and it was made in 1980 at ATV, which the same network that made Till Death, which was a short-lived one-series revival of Till Death Us Do Part, with Alf and Else living in Eastbourne. Yeah. It didn't do very well, and then they did In Sickness and in Health on the BBC later. That was kind of the proper sequel, so to speak. Yeah. Anyway, so this was and this seems to be a precursor to that. I don't know if it was officially like, oh, let's get that character out there and drum up a bit of interest.
Yeah,
but it was definitely made by the same people and everything like that. William G. Stewart is the producer director. He also made the series. You remember William G. Stewart off of 15 to 1? Yeah. So that name jumped out at me. I never recognised that name.
I think William G. Stewart was the Richard Osman of his day. So he was like he was a proper TV producer, but then appeared on a quiz show. And you're like, he's the quiz guy. What's he doing producing television programs?
But yeah, so this was an audience with Alf Garnett, basically, and he gets up there and does an hour of character stand-up. Half an hour of our character stand-up.
And it's pretty horrific.
Now, I've got nothing against the some of them are quite bright, you know, especially ones that play football. But there's no need for this £1 million transfer fees with him. God blimey, a few bits of broken glass, few coloured beads, you can buy half the nation. And there's no need to buy them football boots. Just lace their toes together and send them out there. And they'll play their hearts out for you as long as you motivate them right. You win today, John, you could have their goalkeeper for your supper.
So this is the difference between having the Scousegit there who's railing against you and arguing every point.
There's no pushback.
And having him just rant sort of racism and bigotry to an audience who are laughing and clapping.
It's really horrible. And look, I don't like the way he talks in the series. Like, I'm not saying, it's fine in the series. I don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable. But I can understand, putting that into context of the 60s, I can understand what they're trying to do. And it kind of works on its own terms. That 1980 special is just a racism. It's just a guy shouting racist stuff. Bigoted stuff. It's not just racism.
No, not just racism. And if you know the character and you know where it's coming from, it's kind of like, okay, I see what's happening here, but it doesn't undercut itself satirically enough to justify it. And I think we also have to bear in mind that what was on the edge, on the line in 1965 or 1980 even, is way over the line in 2024, watching this now. So I think maybe watching that back then, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's not, he's a bit right of centre, isn't he? But, but now it's just like, oh my God, this is like, Enoch Powell.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, if our listeners are interested, they could go and see that. Wait, is it available on YouTube? Where did you find it?
I'll tell you where I got it. It came on the DVD of Till Death. It was kind of packaged with that as an extra thing, I believe. So yeah, it's on.
Well, it's interesting. It's not, if viewers of a certain disposition wouldn't enjoy it, but it's an interesting time capsule.
But do you remember when we talked about Time, Gentlemen, Please? And I mentioned that I went to see Al Murray just a couple of years ago doing his live show, and it didn't work for me in the same way. Like, obviously, Time, Gentlemen, Please is slightly different, but even watching Al Murray Pub Landlord in 2000, 2001, whatever, the DVDs, it wasn't cutting himself down in the same way. And I think the same may be true here, that it's like, if you're doing the same character, it's the same writer for 20 years, whatever it is, maybe you lose touch with, in your head what you're doing, and so you don't particularly feel like you need to highlight it all the time. But a new audience comes to that, it doesn't necessarily work. And I found that when I went to see Al Murray the last time. It just was like, no, this is just like watching kind of Nigel Farage, railing against stuff. It doesn't feel far enough removed, and it doesn't feel like you're cutting it down at the knees enough.
Okay, let's get back to our Christmas dinner table. So now we get a knock on the door, and Alf goes and answers the door, and it's Wally the milkman, played by John Junkin.
John Junkin, yeah.
Now, I must confess, I sort of recognised his face. I was I know that guy. Who's that guy? And I had to look him up. But then when I saw the name, I remember John Junkin as a sort of older chap in the 80s who would appear on, like Willie Rushton. He was on Blankety Blank, and he'd appear on Wogan and tell funny stories, that sort of thing. I didn't know he was actually an actor.
Yeah, which makes sense. He was a writer as well. I think he did a lot of writing. Yeah. Worked with like Barry Cryer. I kind of put him into the same category as Barry Cryer.
Exactly that box, yeah.
Probably did a lot of Just a Minute and all that kind of thing.
That's exactly the seat that John Junkin sits in my brain, yes.
But yeah, obviously this is relatively young John Junkin, and he's an actor. He's just popping up in bits. He appears in a few episodes of Till Death Us Do Part. As the milkman. This was literally
regular gig.
3 episodes, I think it was.
Okay.
But yeah, he turns up, and we've dealt with this before in our Christmas episodes, the tradesman's Christmas box.
Well, we saw this last year when we did Rising Damp, didn't we? And Rigsby was very reluctant to give it was the postman in that case, his Christmas bonus.
No, it was the milkman. It was the post lady who came in for a
that's
kiss.
That's right. I'm misremembering, yeah. But Wally's absolutely brazen, isn't he? He walks in, he has a scotch, he sexually assaults Rita, and then he asks for money.
Yeah, and this is on Christmas Day. Is like
Christmas Day. That's it. Yeah, and he actually makes reference to it. I was here yesterday, but you didn't pay me, so I've come back. I am aware of the concept of a Christmas bonus, but this appears to suggest that it's mandatory.
Yeah, which Alf Garnett certainly doesn't appreciate.
Exactly. Well, else admires his cheek.
And he is a cheeky chappy because he gives her a little, he's sort of complimenting her on the way out and all that.
Gives her a little mistletoe kiss.
Yeah.
And then just as he's leaving, we have another slight guest appearance. So there are some Christmas carolers outside. And Alf, having just lost 10 bob to the milkman, is furious. He pulls the flowers out the vase and he goes out all set to chuck the flower water over these carol singers. But the vicar's with them!
Yeah, a man of the cloth has turned up with the little children, so he's not. He can't assault the children in front of him.
So let me ask you this, Alan: if you opened the door all set to throw a vase of flower water over some children, but were confronted by the vicar, now you've got in your hand this vase. Yeah. What would you do?
I'd drink from it, like
exactly correct. You would drink from it because that would make it less conspicuous.
Yeah, like Brian in Phoenix Nights. He always has his vase full of scotch because he can reach the optics.
But, it is, if someone answered the door to you, if you knocked on someone's door and they answered the door with a vase in their hand, you would think, that's a little odd.
Yeah, but maybe they're about to put some flowers in a vase.
That oddness would not be dissipated if they then drank the water from the vase. That would be, I would suggest, odder. Anyway, that's what he does. I'm not sure anyone has ever come to my house and sung carols as an adult.
Yeah, it's not a thing these days, is it? People don't...
I don't think it is.
I don't know if it ever was. I don't know of it as a thing. It's just, in my mind, it's a Dickensian thing that is like...
Are you just thinking of A Christmas Carol now?
But that's... Yeah, but you know what I mean? Like, it's like, oh, yeah, little urchins coming around singing, and it's snowing. It always snows on Christmas.
I did it. In the 1980s, I did it.
There you go, then.
I remember banging on doors with a bit of "We wish you a Merry Christmas" and my hand out.
Well, there you go. I'm 10 years behind you. I didn't do that.
I definitely did, and I can't honestly say we made loads of money. I don't recall, but every little helps. Anyway, kids these days, they're all got pocket money, haven't they? With their Xboxes.
They're probably making more money on Bitcoin than you.
Okay, so now we get a little bit of another grumble from Alf because he's complaining that the Christmas presents he's received are substandard.
It's the fort, Dad.
The fort?
Yeah.
The fort? Here, look. 5 bloody whiffs. Yeah. Eh? That's what you bought me for Christmas, isn't it? 5 bloody whiffs! Well, where's the fault in that then?
So if you're wondering what a whiff is, what he means is it's a sort of small cigar. So they're not even proper cigars, just little 5 bloody whiffs.
And he's also got a pair of socks.
Socks that have got substandard written on them.
They're seconds, but that's all right.
Which, in fairness, feels like a legitimate grumble.
yeah. The problem with it, though, why Alf is still, held up as a hypocrite, is because he hasn't got anybody anything.
No, that's where it falls down, isn't it? So he's grumbling about these presents that his family have bought him, and what has he got for them?
Crap.
Nothing. Not a thing.
Now, at this point, where Alf starts getting a little bit worked up, and he picks up the vase and throws it against the wall and smashes it into pieces. Which strikes me as an insanely violent thing to do.
Toxic.
And it's just shrugged off, which makes me think it's a perfectly everyday occurrence.
Yeah.
They don't even get up to, I'll wipe that up. There's a lot of water all
There's
over.
broken glass and water everywhere. It's just dad being dad.
Is this sitcom logic, or is it... That's just what the 60s, that's what people were like.
I think it's
then.
sitcom logic, Alan. I think no matter how deranged, that's a point being crossed. Speaking as an ex-drinker, there is an unspoken thing here, which is that Alf is absolutely hammered now.
Yeah.
So he's now throwing things around, and the next thing that happens is he gets all sad and he gets maudlin and tells this sad story about when Rita... The story is that when Rita was little, he didn't have enough money. She was desperate for this doll's house and a little china dolly. And he didn't have enough money, but God smiled on him because he put his last 10 bob on a doggy. And that doggy came in at 25-1. And so he bought this house. And it's the sort of... He's telling this story with great emotion and a catch in his voice. But of course, he's undercut by Else, who finishes the story. He got drunk and fell down the stairs and broke the china doll.
This little exchange is till death us do part in one scene. It is this hypocritical man who wants credit for something which, even in his own telling of the story, he went and put his last money on a bet.
Yeah.
And this time it won. The other 400 times he's done it didn't, And then his alcoholism still ruined the day.
But there's not. But you just said a minute ago, this is till death us do part in a nutshell. It's not just Alf in a nutshell, because then Else undercuts him, undermines him, and Rita falls for it anyway.
Yeah.
Rita says, "Oh, Dad, it's the thought that counts. I love you." And it's like, what are you doing? Did you not listen to that story?
And Mike is absolutely pissing himself throughout the whole thing.
Yeah. Although I will say this, Mike is like laughing as Alf's getting emotional. It's not a great acting performance by Tony Booth. He's like pretending to laugh. It's not good.
But look, we've dealt with politics. Let's get into religion. Obviously, the Scousegate is an atheist. And whatever is the opposite of Alf, basically.
Yeah.
The interesting thing I found in this scene is that when Mike is starting to talk about how, there's no heaven, it's all a con to make people sort of just deal with their miserable lives. They think there's a reward later on. And what I found really interesting was that Else was like, no, I don't want to, this is silly, I don't want to talk about this. Because she doesn't want to start thinking about how her miserable life is for nothing. That's definitely not what she wants to get into her head. She cannot face that truth.
She don't want to start picking at that.
Yeah, you don't want to do that.
Yeah. All right, so, a massive, massive row emerges, but then it all gets settled down because the Christmas pudding arrives.
Yes, a traditional Christmas pudding. The
It doesn't
sort
look good,
you
does
have
it?
to set on fire.
It doesn't look
Does
good.
Christmas
It looks like
pudding ever look good?
Well, maybe not.
Because your classic cartoon Christmas pudding has a bit of like frosting and a holly on top. That kind of what gives it the
it
picture.
just looks like a sort of brown football.
That's what Christmas pudding looks like.
Anyway, Mike is desperate to set fire to it. So we ain't got any brandy, so he uses Alf's whiskey, which Alf is, I've got to say, quite legitimately annoyed about. There's a waste of perfectly good whiskey, and I couldn't agree more. The thing goes up in flames, but he's put way too much whiskey on it, so it's like, it's a serious risk.
And because this is old school live television, that thing's on fire, and it's on the
you're
table.
right, actually.
The tablecloth's on fire.
It did go up.
The camera's all overexposed because it's too bright.
Yeah, it is, yeah. So how do they put the flames out, Alan?
Chuck custard on it.
We've totally inundated the pudding. Just pour custard all over it. Which I
So,
quite
yeah,
like.
Una Stubbs putting her hand in flames pours custard all over the pudding. But, you know, that's what you're going to do anyway. You're going to put custard on it. Stop moaning. Just eat your Christmas pudding and shut up. Just one more Christmas tradition here, the traditional Christmas pudding choking hazard.
Yeah, every time. Every time when you see a Christmas pudding, it's Chekhov's threepenny bit is in there.
So, of course, Alf chokes on the threepenny bit that has been deliberately placed into a Christmas pudding.
Did you get the thing where he said, "Oh, it's got nickel in it. That's poison." He was really worried about it.
Yeah.
So apparently, threepenny bits used to be made of silver. They were really small, but people grumbled because they were losing them. So they changed it from a small silver coin to a larger, like nickel brass coin, like a like you might say a 2p piece now. That was in 1937. So that was 29 years before this program was made. But he was still grumbling that they've changed the threepenny bit. I quite like that. I like it.
And then basically we end with a food fight. They just start throwing food at each other.
Of course. I think if you've got a sitcom which is entirely set around a dinner table, it's going to end in a food fight, isn't it? Is that a golden rule?
I feel like in reality, this relationship, these people would end in a fist fight. So can't quite do that on telly. So it has to be a bit more cartoonish and slapstick. But yeah, this does entirely feel like a family that would end in blows, these two men, and then they would just be friends afterwards. You know, it wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Well, it is what we now call toxic masculinity.
Well, so that's the end of the episode, and that's Christmas Day done, isn't it?
Well, I think we've done all right here, Alan. I don't feel like we've fallen out. I haven't broken anything. I haven't thrown any food at you. We're brothers. We're family. We should be at least swearing.
Let's not get too hasty. We will be having a family Christmas at some point over the season.
Oh God, yeah.
I'm sure we might. Well, we don't fall out, but certain members of the family do, let's say. No, not recently. It's all a lot calmer these days.
I'll tell you something. One of the first things you said when we started recording here was, what's the first thing you want to talk about at the dinner table? Politics and religion. I will not be doing that. I'll be steering clear of those subjects, those hot button issues.
Yeah. You'll also be steering clear of the drink, which will probably help.
That will help, yeah. No cask of ale at the Allen family Christmas. We should perhaps tell people what we're going to be doing next, because our series is officially finished now. We got a couple more bonus episodes for you, and we will be back in the spring with some new episodes. So the first episode of our next series in the spring will be Are You Being Served? It's a classic. There's also loads of them to watch, which is why we need a little bit of time.
There's a lot, isn't it? Yeah, there's a lot going on there, though. And I just read Jeremy Lloyd's autobiography, which I'll talk about more in detail on the show, but just as a little peek, it's fantastic. It's the biography itself. I would recommend reading Jeremy Lloyd's autobiography. Don't expect too much inside knowledge of sitcoms, but it is a Partridge-esque wonderful tale of a life, so it's worth reading.
I'm looking forward to talking to you about that. That's great. Well, listen, thank you to all of our listeners for a good year. Thank you for all the feedback you've given us on the socials. Thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading and all that business. And have a great Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. We will see you in 2025.
Bye.
Bye.